Born in 1792, Percy Shelley was part of the radical anti-establishment generation of writers who became known as the Romantics. Percy Shelley was a rebel and a revolutionary. A lot of his works were overtly political. Ozymandias the poem definitely has its roots in the democracy and the nationalism that was raging across Europe at the time. Described as being part of the second generation of Romantic poets, Shelley was deeply respectful of nature and also sceptical of humanity's attempts to dominate it. Similar to Blake, Shelley was also fiercely against the establishment. In fact, he famously got expelled from Oxford University from writing a paper on atheism. It's believed that Percy Shelley wrote this sonnet in competition with his friend Horace Smith. The poem was written in 1817, just after the British Museum announced that it had found fragments of an ancient statue of a pharaoh king, Ramesses II, something that would have definitely interested Shelley and Horace at the time. Shelley may well have heard of these acquisitions, and he may have been motivated to write about the statue's remains. For most people, it's Shelley's keen interest in challenging conventions, both political and poetic, that we absolutely thrive off when reading his poetry today. Before we get stuck into the poem, it's important to remember the following. Shelley's poem Ozymandias is a warning about the transience of power. It's an assertion of humanity's impotence compared to that of the natural world. Shelley himself was fiercely against the establishment, and he challenged the conventions, both political and poetic. That's a lot of information to take in at one stage, so let's just pause and summarise. Percy Shelley's poem tells the story of a broken statue depicting a once powerful ruler. It shows how time and nature has destroyed the statue and the legacy of the tyrant. Within the poem, Shelley mocks the establishment and highlights the transience of power. Now let's remind ourselves of the poem itself. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive. Stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal, these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." Let's have a look at the first line of this poem. It's almost mythical, painting a picture of an antique land and recounting the wonders of a great statue hidden for hundreds of years. It's through this line that Shelley immediately presents the power of words. This is merely a story, hearsay, someone's legacy, told from the perspective of the poetic voice. It's here that the story begins. Remember that it's the way in which a story is told that presents a character or a person in a certain way. It's within the speaker's power of storytelling that presents the great dominance of Ozymandias. Arguably, the poem presents us with a framed narrative, a story within a main story. In Ozymandias, the narrator claims to have met a traveller who tells them of their own experience in a distant desert. Think carefully here. We have someone else recounting the story that they heard initially from a traveller. This again shows the power of words and legacy. Without this storytelling, we wouldn't even know the statue existed. In the next part of the poem, Shelley establishes his setting. He presents us with this vast and intimidating landscape. Reflect on some of the lines that come later on in the poem and think about why it was so important to present the landscape in this way. Notice how Shelley sets up his setting and try to feel that wonder and isolation that it presents. Take note of the paradox of the vast yet trunkless legs of stone. The description is almost almighty with the vast, yet non-existent with the trunkless. Listen also to the sibilance. It sounds like the sand blowing across the barren desert, almost snake-like, heightening the isolation and deception of this once great king, now merely a crumbled statue. It is also important to notice the clever use of form in this poem. Shelley uses broken lines, enjambment and caesura to replicate the crumbling and broken statue. Look at the way this speaker describes the statue. The personified image of the frowning, sneering and wrinkled lip presents a ruler that intimidated and belittled his subjects. The sneer in particular could represent his pride, his arrogance, and the disgust and disdain he had towards others. Notice also the alliterative C of this line, the cold command. It's quite cutting and aggressive, again representative of the type of ruler Ozymandias may have been. This interesting description of the face makes it impossible to ignore how the speaker also felt the intimidation of the face of the statue, even though what they were looking at were just the remains. It's as if this once great ruler still dominates even after death. In this line we start to get a real sense of the irony. The face is half sunk and therefore half hidden by the sands. The face itself is shattered, broken, fragmented. It's no longer whole, physically or metaphorically. Perhaps the word lies could have a double meaning here. The statue literally lies in the ground, but it also could be metaphorical, perhaps a reference to the lies and deceits of the tyrants, rulers, and ultimately the establishment. It could be said that the sunk and shattered physical image of the statue is representative of how tyrannical power sinks and shatters as time goes on. Perhaps this is Shelley's way of bringing to the fore the transience of tyrannical power. As the poem progresses, we get a third-person story, that of the sculptor who created the statue. Shelley presents the power of art here, as the statue, although crumbling, does still survive to tell its story, perhaps a reflection of the careful work of the person who created it. Think about the aggressive way in which the sculptor stamped these features onto the statue. Maybe this is representative of the aggressive and angry ruling of Ozymandias, or an angry rebellion of the sculptor attackingly carving the fearful image onto the stone. Shelley presents a paradox in the lifeless description of the statue, reminding his readers that the statue is not real, yet it's still aggressive, intimidating, and full of contempt for those that look upon it. The next line, "the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed," is quite interesting. Perhaps it's a play on the idiom "to bite the hand that feeds you," which means that you shouldn't criticise institutions and people in positions of authority. Perhaps another way of Shelley mocking the establishment's rule. Furthermore, the image of the hands mocking its subjects and the heart feeding them proves that Ozymandias was an oppressor. He took from his subjects more than he gave to them. They were his prey and he was the predator. And then that brilliant statement that brings us back to the tyrant himself. This is a real defining moment. Ozymandias' statue was raised on a pedestal above his subjects, looking down on them, and now it's just the pedestal that remains, but his power still lasts within the inscription. It's fascinating that it's the words that have remained solid, robust, and not broken by the sands or by time, yet the statue, Ozymandias, and his kingdom has all crumbled away. The colon almost isolates this line as we wait in anticipation for the words of Ozymandias. Again, Shelley presents the power of words and legacy, as without this inscription, Ozymandias almost completely loses his tyranny and intimidation. Then we get the really famous and incredible line, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings." Look at how Ozymandias has an almost obsession with stating his name first. It's as if just mentioning his name is omnipotent and indomitable. King of Kings is a biblical reference to Christ, again emphasising his hubris and intimidation. It's as if he thinks he is the ultimate king of all kings, higher than Christ himself. Remember that Shelley had no time for gods, or God either. Indeed, he had been expelled from the University of Oxford for writing his pamphlet called The Necessity of Atheism. This just further highlights how fiercely against the establishment Shelley really was. Ozymandias tells us to look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. You can almost imagine him shouting this across to his servants as they build more statues. The imperative look shows how tyrannical this ruler was, but also, ironically, helps to underscore the ultimate fragility of human power and the importance of legacy and art, as there is now nothing really to look upon. The exclamatory despair is overtly commanding, intimidating, and passionate. But perhaps now we despair not the might of his empire, but the fact that such a mighty empire, even built by the mightiest of all, is destined to crumble to dust. And then we get the brilliance of nothing beside remains. The simplicity of this line mocks the tyranny of Ozymandias and presents the irony of the poem. His power, his kingdom, and most of his statue has now been lost. Time and nature has almost defeated him, and fundamentally will defeat us one day. Shelley shows that time is exceptionally powerful. It dictates what we do, it keeps us moving, and ultimately it has the power to stop. Perhaps time, in this poem, is the most powerful. The oxymoron of colossal wreck shows the contradiction in the poem of Ozymandias' self-perception of immortality and the reality that all earthly power will pass away, leaving the world boundless and bare. The idea that the statue has not just fallen but decays is a pronouncement about the ephemeral nature of power and, in turn, to implicitly critique tyranny. Power corrupts and decays. Although the poem only discusses Ozymandias, it implies that all rulers, dynasties and political regimes will eventually crumble as well, as nothing can withstand time. The desert's power is emphasised over that of Ozymandias. It stretches vast and infinite. The only real legacy the king leaves is evidence of his pride and cruelty. Nothing beside remains. The final important idea to mention would be the clever and representative form of this poem. It's not classed as a conventional love sonnet, nor does it completely follow the rules of a Petrarchan sonnet. In fact, Shelley rebels and opposes the traditional poetic form, using irregular rhyme, rhythm, and metre throughout. Ultimately, Shelley's metaphor, mythical narrative of a once great king, and ironic imagery creates that tension between the intelligent and the aesthetic, and gives this poem its lasting impact. We're now going to explore the big ideas of this poem, because remember, in your exam, it's the big ideas that you compare when looking at two poems. We don't just look at a line-by-line analysis of a singular poem, and we don't just feature spot. So let's have a look at a few ideas now. Like other poets in your power and conflict cluster, Shelley mocks and criticises the establishment. Shelley also aims to show the injustice and corruption of tyranny and the oppression it could create. He most definitely highlights the transience of power. Shelley conveys the ultimate power of time, nature, and art. Finally, he illustrates how mortal power is not eternal or absolute. Think about those other poems from your power and conflict cluster that you could use to compare some of these big ideas to. Blake, for example, also mocks and criticises the establishment. We definitely get a sense of the corruption and tyranny in London. Tissue has a transience of power. There's definitely some sense of fragility in there. You get the idea. Please do go away and do your own research on this poem and others in the power and conflict cluster. In fact, why not do more research on Shelley himself? Do check out my other videos. I hope you've enjoyed it for today.